For most of the 20th century, one company built America's identity, not the government, not the military, a car company. At its peak, General Motors controlled 54% of every automobile sold in the United States. 54%. One company, half the country's cars. Their revenue touched $207 billion in a single year. They employed 900,000 human beings simultaneously, more people than the entire population of San Francisco. They were, by any measurable standard, the most dominant industrial corporation in human history. And then, on June 1, 2009, they filed for bankruptcy. Not a restructuring rumor, not a quiet pivot. Chapter 11, the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. $230 billion in liabilities. Gone. Not shrunk, not wounded, gone. This is not a story about bad luck. This is a story about a company that saw every warning sign, understood every threat, and chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to look the other way. This is the corporate autopsy of General Motors. To understand the magnitude of the fall, you have to understand the magnitude of the empire. General Motors was founded in 1908 by William Durant in Flint, Michigan. Within 2 years, Durant had absorbed Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and Oakland, the brand that would become Pontiac, into a single corporate structure. It was an act of industrial aggression unlike anything the world had seen. By 1931, GM had overtaken Ford Motor Company as the world's largest automaker. It would not relinquish that title for 77 consecutive years. Let that number sit. 77 years. Uninterrupted dominance. By the 1950s, GM had become something larger than a company. It had become a civic religion. CEO Charles Wilson famously told the United States Senate, "What is good for General Motors is good for the country." He believed that. Washington believed that. America believed that. At their 1955 peak, GM captured 54.4% of the U.S. automobile market. Their stock was the single most widely held equity in America. Millions of ordinary families, teachers, factory workers, veterans, owned a piece of the machine. They built Chevrolet for the working class, Pontiac for the ambitious, Buick for the successful, Cadillac for the elite, a perfectly engineered ladder of aspiration, each rung designed to pull consumers upward and deeper into the GM universe. Their financial power was staggering in scale. In 1979, GM reported revenues of $66.3 billion, equal to the GDP of many sovereign nations that year. They had 618,365 U.S. employees on payroll, union contracts, pension obligations, health benefits, a private social safety net the size of a small country. GM wasn't just selling cars. GM was underwriting the American middle class. In boardrooms, in Senate chambers, in living rooms across the Midwest, the assumption was universal and unshakable. General Motors cannot fail. It was not arrogance. Exactly. It was architecture. A structure so large, so deeply embedded in the economic fabric of the nation, that its permanence felt like a law of physics. And you know what? They weren't wrong. Technically, for 7 decades, the architecture held. Then came the cracks. The inflection point did not arrive overnight. It arrived in layers. Each layer dismissed. Each warning rationalized away by the weight of past success. The first fracture was Japanese. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo detonated the American automotive market. Gas prices quadrupled. Overnight, consumers needed fuel-efficient vehicles. GM had none. Toyota and Honda did. The Corolla and the Civic arrived on American shores like a quiet invasion. Affordable, reliable, economical. GM's response was slow, bureaucratic, and deeply revealing. Instead of engineering competitive small cars, GM lobbied Washington, dismissed Japanese quality as inferior, and waited for oil prices to normalize. They normalized. Briefly, GM exhaled. They should have panicked, because Japanese automakers had not come to visit. They had come to stay. Between 1970 and 1980, Japan's share of the U.S. market grew from 4% to 21%. GM watched it happen and called it a phase. But the deepest, most devastating crack, the one that defines this autopsy, came in 1996. In 1996, General Motors built the future. They called it the EV1. It was the world's first mass-produced electric vehicle from a major automaker. Zero emissions, fast, sleek, forward. Drivers who leased EV1s formed communities around them. They organized protests to keep them. They wrote letters. They begged. And GM crushed them, literally. In 2003, GM recalled every single EV1, refused all buyout offers from drivers willing to purchase them outright, and sent every last vehicle to the desert, where they were physically destroyed. The official reasoning: the economics did not yet support mass EV production. The unofficial reasoning: petroleum industry relationships, internal combustion infrastructure, and dealer network resistance. In 2003, GM killed its electric vehicle program. In 2003, Elon Musk was quietly incorporating a company called Tesla Motors. But here is what GM completely missed. They didn't just kill a car. They surrendered the future. And inside the company, the culture that enabled that decision had been calcifying for decades. By the 2000s, GM's internal structure had become a monument to institutional dysfunction. 14 layers of management separated factory floors from executive suites. Decisions required committees to form committees. Engineers who flagged safety defects were sidelined. Culture rewarded consensus over truth. The infamous phrase that would later surface in congressional testimony, the GM nod, a gesture of agreement in meetings that carried no actual commitment, had become organizational policy. Everyone nodded. Nothing moved. The machine had grown too large, too rigid, and too certain of its own immortality to course correct. By 2005, the numbers were beginning to tell the truth that the boardroom refused to. GM posted a net loss of $10.6 billion that year. In a single calendar year, $10.6 billion erased from existence while executives debated brand positioning. They closed plants. They cut tens of thousands of workers. They did not cut the structural weight dragging them underwater. Pension obligations, retiree healthcare commitments, legacy costs accumulated across 7 decades of union contracts. By 2007, GM carried $1,600 in legacy costs embedded in the price of every single vehicle it manufactured. Toyota carried $107 per vehicle. GM was not competing on engineering or innovation. GM was competing with one hand zip-tied to its own history. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis did not create General Motors problems. It simply removed the floor that had been hiding them. Credit markets froze. Car sales collapsed. GM's cash reserves bled out at a rate of more than $1 billion per month. In November 2008, GM's CEO Rick Wagoner walked into Washington with his hand extended. He arrived on a private corporate jet. Congress noticed. The optics were devastating. The hearing was brutal. And for a brief, surreal moment, the United States Congress debated whether to allow the largest industrial corporation in American history to simply cease to exist. They chose not to. The U.S. government extended $49.5 billion in emergency bailout financing, the largest government intervention into a private industrial company in American peacetime history. In exchange, the U.S. Treasury took a 60.8% ownership stake in General Motors. The most powerful car company in the world had been nationalized. On June 1, 2009, the filing was made official. $230 billion in liabilities. 8 storied brands: Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, Saab, discontinued, erased. Hundreds of dealerships shuttered. Thousands of suppliers collapsed. 21,000 salaried positions eliminated in a single restructuring wave. The industrial colossus that had once employed nearly 1 million people filed for bankruptcy protection with fewer than 235,000 workers left. GM emerged from bankruptcy on July 10, 2009, 39 days. Fastest major industrial bankruptcy restructuring in history. The new GM was leaner, reorganized, technically alive. The U.S. government eventually sold its stake, recovering approximately $39 billion of the $49.5 billion invested, a loss of roughly $11 billion in public money, paid by taxpayers, for a company that had spent 77 years calling itself invincible. The EV1, The entire program, its patents, its infrastructure, its institutional knowledge, crushed and buried, more than a decade before the electric vehicle became the defining transformation of the global automobile industry. The market that GM abandoned in 2003, by 2023, Tesla alone was valued at more than $700 billion, more than 3 times what General Motors lost in its collapse. Pontiac, gone, like it never existed. Saturn, gone, like it never existed. The 900,000 workers, the 54% market share, the civic religion of American manufacturing, gone. What remains is a smaller company in a changed world, still learning, slowly, that the future does not wait for institutions that believe their own mythology. The EV1 was crushed in the desert, the servers went dark, and somewhere in the Nevada sand, the future that General Motors built, and then deliberately destroyed, is still buried, waiting.